Welcome to Paals. It's Prof Anyanwu's anatomy lecture series. In today's lecture, we'll be looking at the anatomy of the brainstem. If you are just watching my video for the first time or you have not subscribed, we will encourage you to be part of this amazing, great anatomy family where we make anatomy simple. So in our lecture today on brainstem, we'll be looking at 4 parts to this lecture. The first part, the one you're watching, we'll be considering the general features of brainstem, and then we'll narrow down to the external features of the medulla. In part 2, we'll look at the internal features of medulla and also consider its clinical correlates. In part 3, we'll look at the internal and external features of the pons, and in part 4, we will complete the remaining part of brainstem, where we'll consider the internal and external features of the midbrain. So let's go to class. Now the brainstem is that part of the brain that is seen between the cerebrum in the proximal part and spinal cord in the distal part. This is the extent of the brainstem, and it's like a tree, just like the name sounds, like the stem of a tree that hangs on a number of structures in the brain. Now proximally we'll be seeing the cerebrum here. Now posteriorly we'll be looking at it, be connecting to the cerebellum, and then distally it will continue as the spinal cord. So this part of the brain is located in the posterior cranial fossa. Now here is the posterior cranial fossa, and then this is the part where we are going to see the brainstem lodged in. We'll look at the parts of the brainstem. What we have here, this is an anterior view, and then this anterolateral view. In this view, we are seeing the midbrain, the proximal part, that's the from this part, that's the midbrain, and then here is the pons, and then distally here is the medulla, or the medulla oblongata. Now there are so many contents, a number of structures to be seen within the midbrain. Some of these structures are the pathways. We'll see a number of reflex centers, and then so many nuclei, particularly the nuclei of the cranial nerves. So we'll be seeing the brainstem serving as a major relay station for both sensory, both motor, and autonomic information. For the cranial nerves, we'll be seeing the nuclei of the 3rd to the 12th cranial nerve within the region of the brainstem. So the brainstem is a site of termination of numerous ascending and descending fibers. Now let's look at the structures relating to the brainstem. We'll start from the proximal part. Now in the diagram we have here, this is the thalamus. Now here is the midbrain. This region is the region of the midbrain. Remember, the brainstem has 3 parts. The upper part here, the midbrain, the intermediate part here, the pons, and then the distal part here, the medulla or medulla oblongata. Now we'll move up to the structures that are related proximally. So relating here, from this point up, this is the region of the thalamus. So proximally, we see the brainstem relating with the thalamus via the midbrain. Then anteriorly here, we're also seeing the hypothalamus, and then overall here, we're looking at the cerebrum. So structures relating to the midbrain to the brainstem proximally are 1, the thalamus here, 2, the hypothalamus here, and then the rest of here is the cerebrum. Now structures relating inferiorly, here we see the medulla. The medulla will continue distally as the spinal cord. And then for posterior relation, we are seeing the pons. This is the pons, and then we are having the cerebellum at the back. So we see this cavity separating the pons and part of the medulla from the cerebellum at the back. This cavity is the 4th ventricle. So proximally, we're seeing the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the cerebrum. Posteriorly, we're seeing the cerebellum, and then distally we are seeing the spinal cord. Like other parts of the brain, the brainstem also has cavities within it. We have this cavity within the midbrain and also have a cavity between the pons anteriorly, medulla anteriorly, and cerebellum posteriorly. Now we'll start with the midbrain. Here again is the midbrain, and then we have this cavity that is called cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius, which is a cavity of the midbrain. Now we have the cavity of the pons and medulla and the cerebellum. This cavity is called the fourth ventricle. So what the cerebral aqueduct does is to connect this fourth ventricle to another cavity at this upper part, the third ventricle, which is the cavity that is seen between the thalamus. We'll be considering the connections of the brainstem to other parts of the central nervous system. We are going to start with the cerebrum. The brainstem connects to the cerebrum through the midbrain. This is the midbrain. And then the part of the brain above the midbrain, we have the diencephalon and the cerebrum. So the connection of the brainstem to the cerebrum is through the midbrain. And the midbrain does this connection through one of its structure, the one I'm pointing at, which is called the cross cerebri. We have two, one on the right and one on the left. The next structure that connects to the brainstem is the cerebellum. Now this is the cerebellum. These connections are between the three parts of the brainstem. Now for the midbrain, it's connected to the cerebellum via a structure called superior cerebellar peduncle. For the pons, the structure, as we are seeing here, connects to the cerebellum, and the name of that structure is the middle-cerebellar peduncle. Then, for the medulla, it connects to the cerebellum via a structure called inferior cerebellar peduncle. We are seeing a number of those in this other diagram. We can see a number of those structures. Here it's clear. This is pons, and here is its connection to the cerebellum. This is the middle cerebellar peduncle, and here is the medulla, and then we have its connection here through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So we can see a little from the image we have here. We can see a little of the inferior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle, and a little of the superior cerebellar peduncle here. Now the third connection is to the spinal cord distally, and the connection to the spinal cord is through the medulla. So medulla continues distally as the spinal cord. In this section, we will consider the cranial nerves and their attachment to the brainstem. Apart from cranial nerves 1 and 2, as we noted earlier, the rest of the cranial nerves have a relationship with the brainstem. We will start with the midbrain. In the midbrain here, we'll be seeing two cranial nerves. This is cranial nerve 3 and that's cranial nerve 4. Cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor, emerged from the part of the midbrain called the interpeduncular fossa, while the fourth cranial nerve, the trochlear nerve, exited the midbrain from the posterior aspect and then had to move in from the sides of the cross cerebri to enter the anterior part. Now the next part is the pons. We actually have one single cranial nerve exiting from the pons, and that cranial nerve is cranial nerve number 5. This is the point of exit. Now between the pons and the medulla, we have this junction. The name of this junction is pontomedullary junction. That is the junction between the pons and the medulla. We have 3 cranial nerves. They are, from here we have the 6th cranial nerve, the abducent, the 7th cranial nerve, and the 8th cranial nerve. So these 3 cranial nerves exited from the pontomedullary junction. Now the rest of the cranial nerves 9 to 12, exited from this region of the medulla. We will start with the medulla oblongata. This is an anterior view of the brainstem. Now, medulla is the inferior part of the brainstem. It continues as spinal cord distally, and this happens at the level of the foramen magnum or at the level of the upper border of the atlas. Now, if we look at medulla, we'll notice that proximally it's broad, and then distally it tapers as it runs down as a spinal cord. The length is about 3 cm, and the width is about 2 cm. The medulla is located in the posterior cranial fossa. Anteriorly, it relates with a part of the posterior cranial fossa called the clavus, and posteriorly, it will be relating with the cerebellum. We'll consider the parts of medulla. Medulla can be divided into two parts, the upper part and the lower part. Now we have two views of the medulla. Here is a mid-sagittal section, and then here is the posterior view. In both views, we can see the two parts of medulla. Now we have the upper part of medulla, which is also called the open part. It is called open part because this is the part that will open into the fourth ventricle. And we have the lower or distal part that will continue as a spinal cord and also known as a closed part, which runs within the central canal of the spinal cord. In both anterior and posterior views of the medulla, we will see some fissures. This is a posterior view of the medulla, and here is an anterior view of the medulla. In both views, we have the midline fissure here anteriorly. We also have a midline fissure here posteriorly. Laterally, we can also see fissures. We can see this fissure running on the lateral side at this side, and also posteriorly, we can also see the fissures running laterally. So we have two main fissures, the midline fissures and the lateral fissures. The midline fissures anteriorly are called the anteromedian fissure, and then posteriorly they are called the posteromedian fissure. The lateral fissures anteriorly are called the anterolateral fissures, and then posteriorly they are called posterolateral fissures. In this slide, we will consider the elevations and swellings on the medulla. We will start with the anterior surface. Beside the anteromedian fissure, this is the anteromedian fissure, we will see some elevations. The first elevation we see is the one we can note here. This median elevation is called the pyramid. Now let us also identify it in the next picture we have here. This is the anteromedian sulcus. Now lateral to the anteromedian sulcus is the first elevation we are seeing here, which is the pyramid. Now this pyramid contains two major fibers, the corticospinal and the corticobulbar fibers. The corticospinal is running from the cerebrum to the spinal cord, and the corticobulbar is running from the cerebrum to the medulla. Now lateral to the pyramid, we see another swelling. This swelling is called the olive. Let us also identify it in the other chart. That's the pyramid, and then lateral to the pyramid, we are seeing the next elevation, which is called the olive. The olive is a mass of gray matter formed by nucleus called the olivary nucleus. This is the olivary nucleus. The next feature important on the anterior surface of the medulla is the decreasation of the pyramidal fibers we just mentioned, and also the emergence of external arcuate fibers from the anterior median sulcus. Now, the pyramidal fibers will cross to opposite side in the lower part of the medulla, obliterating the anteromedian fissure. As you can note here, these are the pyramidal fibers. these are the pyramidal fibers. Towards this lower part, we see them crossing and forming the decussation known as the pyramidal decussation. Because these fibers are motor fibers, so this decussation is also called the motor decussation. Then from the anteromedian fissure here, we also see fibers that will arise and run on the surface of the medulla. These fibers are the fibers that are called the anterior external arcuate fibers. Before we look at the structures in the posterior surface, let's consider the cranial nerves that are emerging from the medulla. We'll start with the anterior surface. In the anterolateral sulcus here, we will see the hypoglossal nerve emerging from this anterolateral sulcus. This anterolateral sulcus is also in line with the sulcus through which the ventral nerve root of spinal nerves also emerge from in the spinal cord. In the posterolateral sulcus, we will see the remaining cranial nerves, cranial nerve 9, 10, and 11. That is the cranial part of the accessory nerve emerging from the posterolateral sulcus. We will now consider the posterior surface of the medulla. Now we'll consider it in two parts. We will first consider the upper part here, and then we'll also consider the lower part. Now in this upper part, we'll be seeing a triangular fossa here. This triangular fossa is forming the lower part of the floor of the fourth ventricle. By the side of this triangular fossa, we see these cylindrical bodies. These bodies are called the inferior cerebellar peduncle. These are the attachments of the medulla to the cerebellum. Now let's go to the lower part. In this lower part, we'll start from the most distal part. Here is the posteromedian sulcus. Now adjacent to posteromedian sulcus is a longitudinal elevation. This elevation is called the fasciculus gracilis. Now lateral to the fasciculus gracilis is another elevation. This is the elevation, and the name of this elevation is called fasciculus cuneatus. Also lateral to the fasciculus cuneatus is yet another elevation, and this elevation is called the tuber cinereum. That's the tuber cinereum. We are going to look at these longitudinal elevations and trace them proximally. Now, in fasciculus gracilis, if we trace fasciculus gracilis proximally, it will end in a swelling. The name of this swelling is called the gracile tubercle. The content of this gracile tubercle is a mass of gray matter called the nucleus gracilis. If you also do the same for the fasciculus cuneatus, if you trace it upwards, it also ends in another swelling, and this swelling is called the cuneate tubercle. Also inside the cuneate tubercle is a mass of gray matter called the nucleus cuneatus. Now the last swelling is a swelling of the tuber cinereum. Now the swelling of the tuber cinereum is formed by one of the nuclei of the trigeminal nerve, and this nucleus is called the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve. That's the tuber cinereum formed by the spinal nucleus of trigeminal nerve. We have come to the end of this part of the lecture. The remaining part of our lecture has been discussed in subsequent videos. If you find this material helpful, you can share it, like the video, and be a part of Paals Anatomy family, where we make anatomy simple. by subscribing. See you in our next video. Thank you and bye for now.